Hi there, welcome to this build of a 49-inch wingspan Diamond Demon, a lovely vintage model from the late 1930s that we've been building from a great set of plans from Ben Buckle in the UK. Well, as you can see in front of me, we've actually got this model more or less finished now. We've got all of the construction done. We've got the wings, the fuselage, the tailplane, all covered in laminating film and this lovely Japanese Asuka tissue. And I'm really excited in this video to start doing some of the finishing touches and pulling it all together. Now I think the first thing that I'm going to do, or the first couple of jobs, is before I dive in and put the servos and the electronics in the cabin and the engine on, there's a couple of little finishing things that I need to do. I want to get in the carbon fibre rods through the fuselage and at the front here for the elastic bands. I want to get those in first and get them glued in, because that affects the kind of the outside appearance, and I might need to glue from inside this rear carbon fibre rod. I also want to get the rear servo fitted and the cable threaded through the fuselage. We need to cut out a panel here and we'll have a quick look at that now. Right, well, if you've seen the previous videos, you'll know that we were going to put this micro servo for operating the rudder right back down in the tail of the plane. It's only a very light 4.5 gram servo, and we kind of mocked up the balance, and I think it's not going to be too bad with the servo down here. We may have to put a little bit of weight in the nose, but hopefully not. So what I'm going to do now, I've put in mountings in the fuselage. You can probably just see them through the tissue and the covering film. What I now need to do is cut this tissue and secure it around the balsa here and make sure that it's nice and secure. Get this servo fitted, threaded in, and then I want to make a hatch that will fit over here with just the top of the servo sticking out. And once I've got that hatch, I will just stick it down there and it will be permanently stuck. If there's a problem, I'll just cut it out, deal with whatever needs doing, and then I'll put a new cover on. So I think that's better than trying to make something removable. Just wants to be nice and light and easily done. So I think that is going to be the first job I'm going to do. But there's also a finishing job on the struts for the legs, which we'll have a quick look at now. Okay, well, a very quick job I want to do is I want to treat these legs. Now this is just music wire I bent up at the beginning of the build, and they just look like standard metal music wire. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to blue them, and I'm going to use this gun blue pen, and this is basically it's a Birchwood Casey pen. It's sold for touching up breeches and barrels on guns. If you've got a scratch, you can just use the pen and mark it. It works on steel, doesn't work on stainless steel. And if we just rub this on here, hopefully you can see after a bit it is starting to darken down. Now I'm going to use this on my push rods as well, and it will darken them down. Now hopefully you can see the difference already there. It wasn't doing that bit. I think I need to just give these a quick rub with a bit of wire wool, because I may have got a little bit of the polyurethane on. But the bit here that I've done so far, you can see that has darkened down nicely. It just gives it a nicer tone. So I'm going to give these a rub with a very fine wire wool and then get them blued, and I think that will look lovely. Right, I've now got the hole cut in the back of the fuselage, and it was quite nerve-wracking having spent all this time putting this covering on to then go and cut it, but that's fine. And I've cut it and I've ironed it onto the balsa, so it's now stuck all around this edge. That's the beauty of laminating film. Even though we covered it with tissue and polyurethane, we can still iron it down, and so that's stuck on there nice and sound. And I've got my piece of string that goes up to the cabin for the servo wire, And I've made, before I put the servo in, I wanted to make myself just a little hatch that will go on top of there once the servo's in. Obviously we'll need to cut a little bit of a hole in for the top of the servo to stick out. But once we've got the servo in, and probably one of the very last things I'll do is I'll put that bit of balsa on, and I'll just put a piece of tissue over the top and gently polyurethane it, so it's completely sealed except for that little hole in the middle, and it'll look like it was kind of made that way. Now I'm going to thread the servo in, and like I say, I've got this really small light servo and I need an extension lead. So what I've done is a bit of heat shrink electrical kind of tubing I've put around the connectors there so they won't come apart. I didn't want to put a big piece of plastic, a big plastic kind of locking thing, so that heat shrink will be fine. If we need to, we can cut it off, no problem. So I'm going to get this threaded through now, and hopefully that will go well. Right, we've now got the servo in and the wire running right the way through, as you can see, to the cabin. So the next job I'm going to do is get those carbon fibre rods in for the wing bands, and then we need to think about getting the tail assembly on and getting this this servo coupled up and working. Right, well, I've now got the wing dowels, those carbon fibre rods, glued in place, and you can see why I wanted to get them in first, because I wanted to get the wing on, held on there with elastic bands, so that I could then glue the tail in place and use those wings as a reference point to make sure I'd got the tail plane nice and square. Because at the end of the day, if we take a central line through the wings and we want to get the tail plane parallel to that central line, so we want to make sure that the wings and the tail plane are lovely and parallel by just eyeing up these tips here with the wing, and as you move yourself up and down you can see those tips just disappear and come into view on the wings to check that it's lovely and parallel. And that's what we need to concentrate on, not the fuselage now, because this is set and this tail plane needs to be right in relation to the wings. I've got a couple of lifts here. These are just balsa with a T-pin in the top, and they're just going to go under the tips, and you can see I can move these and they don't actually do anything because they are just literally touching the underside of those wing tips, so that when I've got it glued and it's belt and braces, just to make sure nothing kind of moves, it stays where it is. So see, if I just touch on the tips, it's not going to go either way. I've had to just sand a little bit of the seat where the tail assembly fits on, just to make sure that it does sit there nice and comfortably, because the last thing we want to do is try and force this to get it square, because the chances are it's just going to move back because we're forcing a twist in the fuselage or something like that, and this fuselage does twist quite readily. Now I'm going to be gluing this in the first instance, and I say the first instance, with some Zap 30-minute epoxy, and I'm just going to be putting that on the two mating surfaces and bringing them together. But then after that I'm going to be putting a bead of epoxy around the underside of the join, and I'll show you what I'm doing when we come to do that. But now let's get this epoxy mixed and get this tail on. I feel very nervous about doing this because it's well, once it's there, we can't change it, so it needs to be right first time. Right, well, the glue is now set, and I am relieved to say everything is all square and looking great. So I'm really pleased to get that done. But now we're going to move on to the second stage of the gluing process, and what I'm going to do is I'll take the wings off, I'll set it up, and we'll have a quick look. Right, well, we've got the tail plane now glued onto the fuselage, and we can see in a couple of places, or a few places, the epoxy is squeezed out just a little bit. Now that's good because it shows that we put enough but not too much, and we've hopefully got really good contact along this joint. But what we're going to do now is we're going to mix some epoxy and put a bead all the way along here, like we did in the fitting of the windscreen, the base of the windscreen a few episodes ago. And I'm just going to use a cocktail stick and just very carefully go along. And that'll do two things essentially. One, it will allow the epoxy, because it's quite runny, to run into that joint as well as forming a bead, and so we'll make sure we've got a really good attachment. And the second thing it will do is just seal this along here so that we don't get ingress of oil and fuel. So it's twofold, and I'll get on and I'll do that now, and then we can have a quick look when it's done. I've now got this bead of epoxy all the way along that joint, which seals it absolutely great, and I think it's well worth doing. It does stand out quite a bit at the moment because it's gloss compared to the matte finish of the tissue and the polyurethane, but this all needs another coat of polyurethane, including the epoxy, which will dull it down and it will disappear, or at least it won't look quite as bright and quite as obvious. And at the end of the day, this is under the wing as well, so it'll be even less visible. I would have two minds about doing this on top of the wing, but underneath I have no problem at all. And like I say, it'll soon dull down once it becomes matte like the rest of the finish. Well, I am dead excited now to have got this finished, and everything's working, fitted, and I think it's looking great. I'm really pleased with how it's turned out. Now we've got all of the radio gear shoehorned in, which I know we've seen previously when I test fitted it, but now we've got the covering on and the windows. It's great to get all that spark ignition system and radio gear in, and we'll take a look at that now. Right, well, you can see now we've got all of this gear shoehorned in. We've got the radio gear at the back here and the spark ignition system at the front. Now we've got the servos, we've got the servo for the elevator here, and we've got servo for the kill switch there to switch off the spark ignition system. And here's the receiver, which is velcroed onto this this cross former, and the aerials go into the rear of the fuselage, and I've just hot glued those onto the sides of the crutch. Now we've got a switch here to switch on and off, and I've put just a little bit of wire that just sticks through with a little bit of a knob on the end so we can operate that. Now I know people have different ideas of whether it should be pull for on or push for on, but I always have it as push for on. And the reason being, when I first started using that, I was worried because of where the switch was that hand launching the model, I may accidentally push the switch in and switch it off, so hence switch for on. I know people will argue it should be the other way, but this is just how I do it. So we can let's put the transmitter on, and we can switch that on, and we've got the elevator, we can see operating there, and the kill switch, which is just on a flick switch on the transmitter. Now with this transmitter I have to have the switch up, which is off, so the ignition is off before the transmitter will switch on and register. So I will always switch it on with the ignition system off, and then I have to flip that to make it live. And if it's in flight and I want to kill the engine, I can just do it with the flick of a switch. You can see we've got the battery here just held in. This is for the radio gear, just held in with a little bit of an elastic band holding it in place and a bit of foam. Now we've got the ignition system at the front here, and the first thing I'll point out is I've just put a little bit of a groove in here for the cable, the high tension lead to go in, so that the wings can sit on there without being lifted up by that cable. And I think that's quite a nice solution, rather than trying to put a hole somewhere in the fuselage to poke it through. Now we can see the coil for the ignition system just in there, held in with this piece of foam, and below that we've got the battery, as you said, way up under the nose of the plane. So if I turn it over, we've got the engine and the battery is here somewhere, taking that weight right forward. Now if I to plug the power in for the ignition lead, we've got these this connection here, and we just plug that in. It's not the easiest thing to do, but there we go, we've got that plugged in now. And we've also got a socket here, or a plug here, sorry, which we can use to charge the battery for the ignition system, which is up under the nose. Now the power is going to, or not, the power is switched on or plugged in for the ignition system, but it's not actually on because of the kill switch. And if I flick the kill switch, now the ignition system is live, and I've wired up a diode at the front, which you can see through the cabin window, and you can just see that lighting up, hopefully. I don't know how visible that is. So I will know if the ignition system is live. So I think what we can do now is take a look at down at the tail end, and we can see the elevator operating, and we can see the rudder and the rudder servo. Well, first off, you can see I've now got this cover over the servo, and if we want to take that out, we just run a knife around and we'll break up the balsa, and it will come out and we can get to the servo if necessary. I'm going to trim this control arm, I think, so it just looks a little bit smaller. But if we just see that working, we've got dual rates on this as well, so that's normal rates, and then we've got dual rates. Of course, we'll need to see how it flies to set that up properly. And the elevator, just that single elevator on the left hand side. Be interesting to see how that works. And I've got 1/2 inch of throw on the rudder, 1/2 inch of throw on the elevator as my starting throws, and that's what's specified on the plans. But like I said, I have got dual rates, so I can just flick that up to get more movement. Right, we'll just take a closer look at this now before we talk about sort of the weight and balance of the model. If I bring it right in there, you can see the engine bay, and the cockpit, or the kind of the cabin, I suppose. And if we just rotate this around, I've really enjoyed doing this covering material. I think it's given a lovely vintage look to it. I think it's a little bit tougher than just normal tissue. It does take extra time, it's undoubtedly it does, but I've really enjoyed it. It's quite a nice process, and the extra time is mainly taken up in just waiting for the polyurethane coats to dry so that you can move on to the next stage. Now, the weight. I've balanced this now, and it balances out really nicely. And if I just find the CG point, there we go, and you can see that is looking absolutely lovely. It's nice in this end of wing shot, you can just see the camber of the under camber of the wing. But anyway, so that's balanced out really nicely. I have added some weight to the nose. In the end, I needed to add 50 grams of lead, and I've put that just under the battery. I've just managed to squeeze it in here. So I took the battery out, put the lead in, and then put the battery back in. I think we're probably, with that lead, we're probably paying for this servo down at the bottom. But I think it was still a good thing to do, because for this rudder, the connections would have been quite awkward. So I'm pleased I've done that, and we've still ended up with what I think is a reasonable weight for this. In fact, actually, I think it's quite light. There's not a lot of weight to this, and I'm actually really happy with the weight. And what I'm going to do now is we'll put it on the scales and we'll see exactly what that weight is. I've got this digital balance. If we put a kitchen roll on it and just tear that, so we get 0 with the kitchen roll on. And then what we can do is, if we just put the wing on upside down, and we get 779 grams. So that is pretty good, 779 grams. I mean, that's a similar kind of weight to the tomboy I made a while back, which had a similar wingspan. In fact, it was an inch smaller wingspan, and that flies beautifully. So there's no reason that this shouldn't. So I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in ounces. I don't know whether I said earlier that the lead I added, the 50 grams of lead, that's 1.7 ounces. But I'm not sure what the weight of this is in ounces. But I'm really pleased with how that feels. It feels a lovely light model. And you know, I can't wait now to get out to the airfield and see how this thing flies. But I'm going to pick a really nice day for the maiden flight. And I always say this, you know, what's the point in rushing it? I've spent 3 months building this, so it'll be nice to get out there on a lovely, dry, sunny, calm day and give this plane the best opportunity it can have to perform well. Because, you know, we may end up needing to trim it a little bit or alter the CG a little bit, so we want good conditions to test it. So anyway, I'm going to draw this video to a close now, and suffice to say, I have enjoyed this build so much. Not only doing this this covering, but also the actual shape of the model, this lovely, lovely diamond shape, and it is quite unique, or you know, it's one of a kind really, the Diamond Demon, and it is a fantastic vintage model designed in the 1930s, late 1930s. And I really hope you've enjoyed watching this build and seeing it take shape, and hopefully you found it interesting and useful. I really appreciate everybody who stuck with me throughout this build and all the fantastic comments and questions that I've had about it. So thanks very much for watching.